Уважаемые участники форума, позвольте
Dear
всех поприветствовать. Мы
participants
немного
of the
задержались,
forum,
поэтому
I
давайте
beg your pardon for being a bit
начнем
late.
сейчас же.
Let me welcome all of you. Let's
Тема нашей дискуссии —
start without any further
независимость
delay.
центральных банков.
Central banks'
Прошлое или будущее.
independence, the future of the
Вы знаете,
past, is
вот
the
только что у нас
title of the
перед
panel
сессией было
session.
обсуждение
Right before
содержимого и самой темы
it, we have
с
had
уважаемыми
a
экспертами, и они
briefing with the
рассказывали
experts,
какие-то
and we
пугающие вещи. Говорили о том, что, например,
talked
в
spooky things.
уважаемых университетах на совершенно таких
For example,
серьезных трибунах
it has been said that
обсуждается вопрос о том,
in some
должны
renowned
ли центральные банки
universities,
быть
it is
независимыми.
being
И
discussed
здесь на форуме,
whether
на
central
предыдущей
banks should
сессии,
be
да, буквально
independent or
1,5 часа
not.
назад,
And
звучал
here,
тоже с
at the
высокой
previous
трибуны
session,
тезис о том,
it
что
has been voiced
монетарная
from a
политика и
high
фискальная
rostrum that
политика
monetary and
в
fiscal
определении определенная
policies,
условность.
well,
Его когда-то
the boundary
придумали
between them is
академики, а на
vague, and
самом
the
деле
academicians
не
invented it
обязательно
in the
совершенно все
past,
должно быть
and it
так,
does not
как мы к
necessarily,
этому привыкли.
it should not necessarily
Как же
remain
все-таки должно быть? Какова роль монетарной
in a bold
политики
line,
и
this boundary. So
что
how it should
ее
be at the
ожидает в
end of the day,
будущем?
and
Вот об
what
этом мы
should
будем
the role of
говорить.
the monetary
Позвольте, я
policy
представлю
be? Let me
участников
introduce the
дискуссии от
panelists.
меня и далее Якоб Френкель, председатель
Jacob
правления JP
Frankel,
Morgan Chase
chairman of the
International,
JP
официальный
Morgan
банк
Chase
Израиля с
International,
91 по 2000
chairman of the
год.
Bank
Давайте
of Israel
поприветствуем.
from 1981 to 2000. Greetings, sir.
Ксения Юдаева, первый заместитель
Ksenia
председателя Банка
Yudaeva,
России.
First Deputy Governor, Central Bank of the Russian Federation.
Чарльз Коломирес,
Charles
профессор школы
Коломирес,
бизнеса Колумбийского
a professor from the
университета.
Columbia Business School.
Кеннет Рогов, профессор
Kenneth Rogoff,
Гарвардского
Professor of
университета.
Economics from Harvard University.
И Олег Вьюгин,
And
председатель
Oleg
наблюдательного совета
Yugin,
Московской биржи.
Chairman of the Supervisory Board of the Moscow
Добрый день.
Exchange.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Итак, первый мой вопрос.
So my
Такой самый
first
общий, я попрошу ответить
question would be
всех на
most
него.
general.
До
I'd like
2008
everybody
года,
to
до
provide an
финансового
answer.
кризиса,
Before
все-таки
the
был
downturn
устойчивый
of
консенсус.
2008, there was a
Монетарная
consensus in
политика
place
занимается
that
сглаживанием
the monetary
экономического
policies
цикла, да, вот
did
таких более краткосрочных
like
колебаний.
assuaging the
Фискальная
ups and
политика
downs
может
of
этим заниматься,
cycles, and the
но
fiscal
все-таки
policies could also
важнее,
look
что на
into
нее
that. But
ложились структурные
more
вопросы,
important
да?
for them is to resolve structural
Политика
issues,
налоговая,
tax
распределение доходов и
policies,
так
the
далее, и так далее.
distribution of
Сейчас есть
earnings and
дискуссии, есть
revenue,
практические
etc.
шаги, как бы вот вне
Now there are
этого
some
русла.
discussions and practical
Какова
steps outside
все-таки
of that
роль монетарной
paradigm, of
политики?
that pattern.
Меняется ли она
So
вот
what is the
сейчас
role of
прямо,
monetary
пока
policy
мы
now?
ведем
Is it
дискуссию?
changing? Has
Я
it been
предлагаю всем
changing?
отвечать
Or
совершенно
is
в
it
произвольном
subject to
порядке.
change?
Пожалуйста,
So please never hesitate to raise a
включайте
hand and
микрофон и
answer. Just
комментируйте тогда,
press the
когда вам
button
будет это удобно и когда вы
whenever
хотите
it's
что-то
convenient
сказать.
for you.
Ну,
We
на первый
shouldn't have
вопрос,
any
господин
order,
Френкель,
strict
начнем с
order,
вас.
but
Давайте
probably
в порядке модератора
probably
попрошу
Mr.
вас.
Frankel, being the moderator, will ask you to be the first one to answer this first question. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the monetary policy and in general economic policy has changed dramatically since the experience of the great financial crisis. I think that the distinction between focusing on short run and long run and saying monetary policy is on the short run and fiscal on the long run is also an inappropriate distinction. Because both or all economic policies have short-term implications and long-term implications, especially when you have capital markets that are linking the future to the present through expectations and other financial instruments. The distinction between short-term and long-term gets blurred. So where does the distinction come from? The distinction comes from the range of policy instruments that are assigned to the various policymakers, but even more importantly, the concept of comparative advantage. And let me elaborate on this very briefly. Monetary policy typically is assigned to deliver public goods. The two important public goods are financial stability and price stability. Let me explain. It is not that growth is not an important objective. but rather the way in which monetary policy views its contribution to the economic performance of an economy is by creating the background that enables growth, prosperity, innovations, and the like. And the background that can be produced by monetary policy is financial stability and price stability. What it means is that the characteristics of a central bank is that it must look more into the longer-term horizon. And you ask, why? Shouldn't everyone look in the long term? Here comes the basic foundation of political economy. Elected governments, by their nature, they are all good people, but by their nature are more focused at the short term. They need to be elected, they need to respond to the electorate and all the rest. Still, the public good that I mentioned, somebody must be assigned to make sure that this temptation to focus on the short term is being offset. And the agency that has been traditionally assigned that role is the central bank and the monetary authority. It also follows that in order to be able to implement its task, it needs to be autonomous. I don't use the word independence because it may create misunderstanding. We are not talking about a chaos that everyone does what he wants, but autonomous to implement the instruments with the perspective of the long term. This is the main issue. And maybe the discussion will elaborate later on additional aspects, but more and more I hear people say, after all, you have not been elected by the people, by the political process. How can you be so powerful? The police commissioner was also not elected by the people. The judges were also not elected by the people. But the people as a whole, with their wisdom, decided to provide the authority to agencies that are ascribed to deal with the longer term, that with their absence, we would not be able to achieve our objectives.
Thank you. I will have more to ask you on that. Но давайте продолжим вот с вводной части. Все-таки меняется.
But let's continue with the introduction. Whether the monetary policy role changes currently, is being changed currently. Mr. Kolamiris, over to you.
Yes, I think as Jacob said, the crisis created dramatic change in what the central banks did. First, I think it's important to recognize what caused it. There were three parts to what caused it. First, sudden action was required, and legislative bodies are not very good at sudden, decisive action. Secondly, there was a lack of legislative consensus about some fairly complicated issues in finance in the United States. Which financial institutions, for example, should be rescued, which not. And third, the traditional instruments, not just in the moment of 2008, but 2009, 2010, the traditional instruments of monetary policy were perceived, I think correctly, as not being by themselves strong enough as countercyclical moves. What all three of these things did, just as a matter of pragmatic necessity, was they pulled the Federal Reserve and also the ECB into actions that can only be described as clearly fiscal. In other words, they have implicit in them a spending and a taxation. And those kinds of actions, subsidization or spending, are not really properly within the jurisdiction, generally, of the central bank. But it happened as a result of a sort of sudden necessities. The problem with this was that it created a question of legitimacy for the institutions of the central banks that engaged in these actions. When you think about the ECB, there was no other authority in Europe that was a pan-European authority. Just like in the Fed, in the US, the Fed was the only authority that could have engaged very quickly in some of the actions that it did. But the problem is, once you step over those lines out of necessity, you create new questions of the legitimacy of your authority, because your authority shouldn't be in a democracy to make important spending decisions that are properly fiscal decisions. And the problem is, out of that in the US, we actually had legislation as part of the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 to limit, as a matter of legislation, what the Fed could do in the future. So maybe you're not aware of this, but part of that legitimacy problem that came from the stepping over into the fiscal authority actually led to a reduction in the Federal Reserve's powers as a lender of last resort. So in other words, the Federal Reserve today has fewer powers as a lender of last resort legally than it had in 2008. As a result of the popular dissatisfaction with this notion of the central banks engaging in fiscal actions, and I would call that the problem of legitimacy. And so I think that we have a little bit of a contradiction here, because on the one hand, the central banks were the only game in town, the ECB and the Fed. They engaged in some actions I think you would say were desirable or necessary, and yet within democracies that creates problems of legitimacy. And I think, just to complete the point, the solution to this is to actually agree upon, in a systematic framework, how you deal with emergencies in advance. And the best example of that, in my view, is the Canadian legislation, which describes very clearly how the allocation of power will occur between the central bank and the Treasury in managing financial crises. But this is not something that's very popular to discuss. If you try to do this in the US right now and say, well, let's talk about how the power is going to be allocated, what most voters want to hear is, we're not going to allocate any power to bail out big banks in the future. We never want to do this again. And so what that means is, you can't politically solve the problem, because any politician who would say, let's try to build that framework, would immediately be very unpopular. And so it's ultimately a political problem of democracies having to look in the mirror and make rational decisions that are going to be consistent with the long-term legitimacy of their institutions. Canada, I think, has been more successful at that than the United States when it comes to financial policy. So I think that's the problem.
When you say central banks did something that is more fiscal, do you only mean the bailouts, or is it also the quantitative easing?
Part of the quantitative easing. So let me explain without trying to get too technical. If I, as a central bank, buy treasury bills, that's considered a kind of the purest kind of monetary policy. If I buy treasury bonds, well, if interest rates change, the treasury could lose money. If interest rates go up, they could lose money on the longer term bond purchases. Some people regard that even as fiscal policy. But now if I start buying mortgage-backed securities in the US, I'm really subsidizing the mortgage industry. I'm subsidizing the housing industry. I'm targeting a fiscal subsidy of a relative interest rate for one industry. That's a fiscal policy, clearly. And the most effective part of quantitative easing was the targeting of mortgage-backed securities, precisely because it had a big effect on the construction industry and the housing industry. I would say the Fed was definitely engaging in fiscal policy, but the ECB was doing the same thing, also by expanding the kinds of collateral it was taking into new areas. So those are fiscal measures, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. I have a question, and I may ask it if you allow, and then
please,
anybody could answer, Mr. Rog, if you as well. So the question is then, we're blaming this discussion, having this issue of central banks' role in independence, mainly on, they were the only game in town, they were the only ones who could act quickly, et cetera, et cetera. My question is, would central banks even consider buying mortgage-backed securities or whatever had rates not gone all the way down to zero? Wasn't it the natural need, because the monetary policy, the traditional one, exhausted its powers, that we actually turn to this more fiscal stimulus, fiscal style stimulus.
If you don't mind, I'll come to that, but I want to pick up on the larger question of this session, which you framed as central banks being under threat, that they'll lose some of their independence. In fact, there's a tug of war, because if I look at in advanced economies, if you read the Financial Times, The Economist, lots of academic papers, it's the other way around. Central banks are viewed as being the only competent agent in town, the only one you trust. And originally they were given monetary policy. And there are a lot of plans to give them much more power, fiscal power. Frankly, we're starting to hear discussion of environmental policy even to central banks. Fundamentally, this is coming not because people aren't trusting central banks, not because the legitimacy's been undermined, but because they are thought to do a better job than the fiscal authorities. I would agree very much with things Charles said and Jacob said. This is something they should resist, because they don't have political legitimacy to make these larger decisions. That's a trap. And a really good example is helicopter money, which you can find 2,000 op-eds saying it's a great idea. I believe I saw The Economist magazine say it was a good idea. The Financial Times plays both sides of it. Ben Bernanke has sort of proposed the idea, flirted with it. Helicopter money is basically the idea that you're in a stalemate in your fiscal authority. They just can't figure out what to do, especially in a situation where you need stimulus. And the normal way to do that would be the fiscal authority would spend money, and if they're running a deficit, the central bank could choose to monetize some of it to hold down interest rates. But helicopter money says, let's just skip that step and have the central bank print money and hand it out to citizens, whoever they feel like it. And of course, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's frustrating that the fiscal authorities aren't necessarily doing what some people want, particularly perhaps in Europe. But if central banks get sucked into this role, that is certainly the beginning of the end of central bank independence. So I would actually say there's much more of that than there is the other way. The fiscal authorities are wonderful. We're so happy with the job they're doing. Let's let them take over the central bank and run that too. That is modern monetary theory, which we discussed this morning, favors that, but that's very much a minority. But at the same time, again, referring to things Charles said, central banks need to defend their legitimacy, to defend the role they're playing, because even if their independence isn't completely removed, it could be that they lose some instruments that they need to effectively have their job. And then I would lastly say, it actually is a gray line of where that should be. And it's debated among scholars. I don't really think there's a lot of debate about narrowly defined monetary policy, meaning setting interest rates, other than modern monetary theory, which, as I said this morning, is not modern, not monetary, and not a theory. Other than that, I don't think there's really a lot of debate about that. On the other hand, where should regulation be and other things is unclear. The central bank does have fiscal powers, but if you pardon me for using a military analogy, I don't know how things are organized here, but we have several branches of armed services, a Navy, an Army, an Air Force, the Marines, and they actually all have some capabilities in each other's territory. The Army has planes, the Army has ships, but I don't really think you'd want them being front and center and running sea operations or air operations. And I think that's the case with the Federal Reserve and these larger issues. Yes, in an emergency, if there's nobody else to do it, and there's paralysis and nothing can happen, yes. But in normal times, that's really not how you want to organize yourselves. But they're not strict lines. They're not. But the one where I think we really need to draw the line, and Jacob Frankel said it very well, is the central bank has to be allowed to take a long-term view because the policymakers have a natural myopia, most of them anyway, and that leads to some of the very unpleasant macroeconomic outcomes of high inflation, financial crises, budget crises, and the central bank, it can't stop those things if the fiscal authorities are determined to have a problem, but it's certainly very important that it's stabilizing the long run.
Ксения Валентиновна.
Madam
Спасибо
Gaidar.
большое.
Thank
Мне
you
кажется,
so
для
much.
нашей аудитории
I think
нужно
that for our
сначала немножко
audience, we
пояснить,
need
что,
to,
в чем
first of
стал
all,
ваш вопрос.
provide some clarification about what the matter of the
Потом
discussion is.
дать на него некоторые
And
комментарии.
later we could probably make some comments upon that.
Собственно, о чем вы говорите, о
So,
каком
you have been
разделении?
talking
Большинство
about the
стран мира
distinction.
последние 20
What is that distinction? Over the past 20 to 30 years, most countries have switched to the inflation targeting
Он
mode.
включает в себя то, что у центральных банков есть долгосрочная цель по инфляции. Есть
Presupposes a long-term inflation goal for central banks
самостоятельно использовать свои инструменты
independence
по
for
достижению этой
central
цели.
banks, them being autonomous and having
Цель по
their proper
финансовой
toolkit
стабильности, она
with respect to the
в этой
financial
части не
stability.
рассматривается, про неё гораздо
In
больше
this
стали говорить в
respect,
последние,
you know,
там, 10,
well, that has become the matter of
почти уже
discussions
15.
of late in the past 10 to 15 years. It is also an important goal, though slightly differing from the core of the functions. So, the mere fact that there's distinction of roles and responsibilities and mandates, like when the central banks kind of have the short-term issues, control the short-term issues, and the redistribution is within the scope of the budget. But let's take a major developed, advanced economy that has a few supply shocks and mostly demand shocks, that is not subject to forex rate fluctuations, and an economy where its central bank has been sticking to the inflation targeting for quite long, even if it's not announced in public. And anyhow, the inflation expectations are anchored strictly. So, within the inflation targeting policies, the central bank can, in the short term, stabilize both inflation and the money supply about the equilibrium point. It should be the equilibrium point that we should be guided by, and this equilibrium point is defined by the productivity level and the productivity growth rate and institutional and demographic factors, etc. It is the consensus that we have. If we go beyond these restrictions that I have mentioned, which is a major economy with most of the shocks in the demand territory, if we go beyond that economy, that consensus would not work properly and wholly. There, I'm not sure whether you read it, just to read Mark Carney's recent remarks on the 9th of January. And all major central banks now, at the start of the year, are kind of fine-tuning or tweaking their policies. Mark Carney spoke in a keynote address, and he has said that over the past 10 years, they found out that in the UK this approach did not work properly, did not work well. Over the past 10 years, the UK has had also supply shocks that impacted the inflation and the money supply, and it is necessary to grasp how these shocks impact the inflation targeting, which is the overarching long-term goal, and what the pace should be in the context of these shocks that will rein in inflation and bring it back to normal. And the second point of his is that after Brexit, they have found out that they are quite susceptible and receptive to the forex rate shorts, and the transition fact is kind of lengthy, is of long-term nature. And here new questions crop up and are raised about the pace of bringing the inflation back to normal, taking into account the risks inherent in the economy. For emerging markets, that wouldn't work on a standalone basis, because they're different from the advanced economies. They suffer from lots of supply shocks as well. And a typical supply shock that both developing and developed economies are facing is the oil price fluctuations or other global commodity price fluctuations. They may vary and go up and down because of the global demand, but of late we have saw directive changes and veering because of the changes in structure of global supply, oil supply. So for emerging markets there are numerous shocks of that nature, and the monetary authorities should think how to respond to these shocks. What should be the pace of reining in the inflation, and how to respond to inflation upswings, and definitely the susceptibility to forex rates would be much more profound and pronounced, and the question is how to respond to that from the monetary perspective. So for the emerging markets, no major changes have come to the fore in the past 10 years, but I must state that we see the advent of more economies where monetary authorities enjoy trust and public confidence, and the inflation expectations are anchored and set. But there is also the appearance of other countries that ruined all the confidence with the monetary authorities and are suffering from the after effects. Like the first group of countries includes some of the East Asia countries in Chile and Israel that used to have hyperinflation in the past, and now it is virtually a developed and advanced economy from the inflation expectations perspective and standpoint. And in these countries, the choices that they're making are similar to those of developed or advanced open-ended economies. There are some countries in transition. Russia and Brazil would fall into that category. I think Brazil switched to inflation targeting long ago, and Russia did it 5 years ago. Will mark 5 years of inflation targeting in place this year for our country. But in the past 5 years, Brazil has made huge headway in terms of greater confidence, and the inflation fell sharply, and in this country inflation fell down as well. Thus, we can reduce the policy rates considerably and dramatically. In the midterm, the interest rates have gone down, both in the Russian Federation and in Brazil over the past year. And there are some other countries like Turkey, which is the most salient examples. They run an experiment of how long you can go towards supporting demand with the help of the monetary authorities, and their inflation soared there, and interest rates have been risen dramatically there. So, which is a testimony of the fact that unless you have reined in inflation targets and you should be prudent in monetary policies, we could start a full debate. So, does it mean that if your inflation expectations are anchored on reined in, the central banks can do other measures? But my question to you, Madam Yudaeva, and to you, Mr. Frankel, both Bank of Russia and Bank of Israel over the past 5 years, we can congratulate the Bank of Russia and the Bank of Israel. You have attained good results, prodigious results, because of the independence. Thanks to the independence of central banks, we have made achievements. But in the current environment, at this juncture, whether the independence of central banks is critical, if you started fighting inflation today, what would change?
Well, I would try to respond by saying that if there are anchored expectations and there are shocks of demand, then the stabilization of inflation and supply are more or less the same goal. They are moving hand in hand, parallel, and there is no choice as to what you have to stabilize. But there is a choice if there are other shocks, like the shocks of supply. That is why central banks are constantly coming up with different indices for inflation, like core inflation or other inflation indicators, trying to pinpoint more meticulously where the shocks are coming from. But central banks, in any way, are looking at different indicators, at consumer price index in particular. And of course, there are sometimes controversies involved, there are contradictions. That is why this is the regime of inflation targeting and not targeting anything else. If you call it that way, that means that you can set forth long-term goals for yourself. Look at the long-term horizon. And you can also take into account the combination of factors, both mid-term and short-term, looking farther into the future. Now, as for independence, I think the key element is trust and confidence. All monetary policy, to a large extent, is about communication and trust. And it is a very important element. It is required so that the market and the agents believe that the true target is inflation indeed. Mr. Frankel?
Thank you. Let me come back to where we started. You started by noting that about 10 years ago, or maybe 12 years ago, with the emergence of the great financial crisis, the world has changed. And therefore, many concepts were put aside, unconventional approaches were developed, etc. One of the issues that we need to address is the consequences of the great financial crisis has been also the lack of trust in experts. There was the narrative, experts have failed. The system was not prepared for it, and therefore experts have failed. The consequences of that approach have been really pronounced everywhere, not only in economics, but also in politics. Outsiders without experience are now having greater chance to receive the driving license of economies, of political systems, because they were not associated with the so-called failure of 2008. And this is a very dangerous conclusion, because the world is very complex, and therefore you really need to have experts and professionalism, and you cannot learn to drive while you are riding the car. And I mention it because the tendency was, let's throw the old textbooks away, because we are in a new era, a new unconventional era. One of the issues that I think we need to remember is that history of hundreds of years across so many places in the world has taught us so many robust lessons that it will be a great tragedy if we throw them away, only because in 2008 the system was found unprepared. So the principle that I want to pursue is, let's not lose the compass, and the compass is still financial stability, price stability, central bank independence, and all the rest, and yes, deal also with the new phenomena. So if you needed to go into unconventional territory, you better address the question of what is the exit strategy? Do we like where we are? Do we like the environment of zero interest rate? Does it have distortions? Does it create bubbles? Does it distort the financial system? Does it weaken the financial industry? After all, the financial industry is the main channel through which monetary policy affects the economy. So if you are weakening the life insurance, pension systems, and the like, don't be surprised that monetary policy may be less effective. Now, being the only game in town sounds like a compliment. I think it is an intoxicating compliment, because before you are enjoying the great authority, you will find yourself responsible to deal with issues that are not your domain. And they are not your domain because you do not have the tools to deal with it. When I came here, I asked somebody to give me a list of what are the issues that are now on the mind of people. And they told me, I wrote down, Brexit, EU, terrorism, protectionism, productivity, poverty, Ukraine, sanctions, structural policies, China, unemployment, Trump, political uncertainty, demography, labor force participation, commodity prices, Iran. Those are all important issues. None of them can be dealt with by monetary policy. None of them. And you know, being the only game in town means that, as Ken said, monetary policy has gained so much credibility that everyone looks at it. It is actually excess credibility. And it's very, very important to recognize that when you have a big orchestra, there are some important instruments, the violin, the trumpet, the whatever it is. Some play the solo parts, but you need to have the harmony that comes from all the instruments. And being the only instrument will not create the harmony, it will not bring the results. So in a time of a crisis, when all the instruments are paralyzed, of course, the violinist that can play well should jump in and try to make a little bit music. But you also should tell people, you did not buy ticket for this solo concert. You have an orchestra. We need to wake them up. So I think it is time for other policy instruments to recognize what is their role, and the important issue for economy, growth, productivity, innovation, nothing to do with monetary policy except for the environment of price stability and financial stability. So when I hear here that central banks find itself under pressure to bail out banks, and I ask why? I remember when I was central bank governor, I was interviewing bank supervisors for a job, because in Israel, bank supervision is in the central bank. And I asked each one who came for the interview, what would be a success of your period as a supervisor? And each one told me, if in my period no bank is closed, I will feel this as a success. And I told them, this means that you are keeping zombie banks alive. This means that you are not allowing the system to function. Of course, it is very difficult to close losing banks, but it is even more irresponsible to throw good money after bad money. So I think that this is where the orchestra has to come in. The voters have to give the legitimacy for the use of budgets and all the rest. But poor central bank, it has enough on its head. Allow it to focus on price stability and financial stability.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid that in our case, the orchestra is coming in, but they still want the violin to be the solo. Олег Вячеславович, скажите, пожалуйста, вот все же, каков ваш ответ на первый вопрос, да, роль Центрального банка монетарной политики, ну и, может быть, финансовой стабильности, потому как
what
вы
is the role of the central bank
значительную часть
in
своей
monetary
профессиональной жизни провели в
policy
банковской сфере?
and now banking stability? That is another question I'd like to ask you, because you spent most of your career in the banking sector. Thank you, Nikolai. As has been mentioned here by all the speakers, central banks did indeed interfere in the fiscal policy through expanding the balance of payments, through interest rates to a certain extent. And that happened during the 2008-09 crisis. But I'd like to emphasize that this was prevention policy. That was a prompt, a swift response of the monetary authorities so as to prevent a bad cycle from kicking in and a run from debt. If they had not done it, then the run on the debt would have had a more deleterious, more nefarious consequences than the ones we witnessed back after the 2008-2009 world financial crisis. Well, central banks did interfere, but did they lose legitimacy as independent institutions? Institutions not reliant upon the central federal executive authority. I do not think they did lose it, because not a single big bank that did so didn't violate their main mandate, which consists in inflation management. But that was in the short term. The question is whether that had any long-term implications and ramifications. The Fed, the European Central Bank, are pursuing this kind of policy, and they do put their legitimacy in future at stake. But if it all is successful, if they do manage to secure the financial stability that they strive for, then they would, on the contrary, boost their legitimacy. Because legitimacy is not purely and sheerly based upon the law, like in Canada, which stipulates in detail what the central bank is supposed to do in case of a crisis. No. Legitimacy is founded upon the perception among the public that the central bank is doing the right thing. Of course, there are always going to be voices that say to the opposite. But if the majority support the central bank, then the central bank enjoys legitimacy, and the same goes for the Central Bank of Russia. It was a long and arduous road to inflation targeting for the Central Bank of Russia, and it did manage to secure some good results because it went step by step, garnering the support of politicians. Well, of course, the case of Russia is a special one. For our country, stability
очень важным показателем
is
для
of paramount
властей,
importance.
не
It's
только для
a very
Центрального
important
банка, но
indicator
для
for the
многих
authorities,
правительств.
not just for the central
И
bank,
поэтому, конечно,
but for the
Центральный
government
банк получал
as a
такую
whole.
политическую поддержку
And of course, the central
в
bank,
достаточно
because of that,
не
did
очень
manage
приятных
to
условиях,
get
когда нужно было
political
снижать
support,
инфляцию, действовать
even
достаточно высокими
when
ставками.
it had
С политической
to
поддержкой
slap
была. И
higher
сейчас
interest
Центральный
rates
банк таким образом
to
российский
rein in the
получил
inflation.
достаточно высокий уровень легитимности.
And that is how the Central Bank of Russia
Весь
managed to
вопрос
secure
все-таки,
quite a
на
high
мой
level
взгляд,
of
заключается
legitimacy.
в том, насколько
But
вот это
the thing is,
пока как краткосрочное вмешательство центральных банков,
this was a short-term
квазифискальное, если так можно
interference. It
выразиться,
was a
насколько
quasi-fiscal
оно
one.
удачным
And the
будет в
question
долгосрочном
is, how much of a success
Это
is it
вопрос
going to
открытый.
be
Это
in
вопрос
future, in the
неизведанный.
long run? And this is an
Мы
open
понимаем, что
question. There is no
высокий
yet
уровень
answer to
корпоративного
it.
долга и
And
суверенного
we do
долга
not know yet, because the high
он
level
создал
of
несколько
public
иную
debt, of
ситуацию
sovereign
для
debt,
большинства
has
экономик,
ushered
в том
in
числе и корпораций.
a new
И их
environment for
поведение
most
изменилось.
economies as well as for many
Насколько
corporations,
в
and
этой
their behavior
ситуации
has changed
центральные
accordingly.
банки в будущем смогут
Against this
держать под
backdrop,
контролем инфляцию,
whether the
если
central banks
сейчас
are
они
going to be
таким
able to
образом
rein in
пытаются
inflation is a question.
вот эту долговую
Right
проблему
now,
держать в
the
руках,
central banks are trying to
как бы держать, не создавая
still
негативных
have a hand
экономических последствий,
on
не
this
инфляции,
sovereign debt
негативных
issue
экономических
without
последствий.
creating
Это
any
риск для центральных
negative
банков, который
implications
для меня
for
пока не
the
ясен. Я
economy.
здесь
But
как говорится,
how
не берусь
this risk is
предсказать.
going to be addressed by the central bank, I do not know yet, and I would not dare
Yes,
predict.
please.
I want to pick up on some of the points about emerging markets that Ksenia started that also makes points that both, related to points that both Jacob and Oleg were saying. Suppose that you're a central bank like, let's take the case of Colombia or Peru, but they're just two examples. In 2007. In 2007, the US was cutting interest rates pretty dramatically, as were other developed economies. What started happening in a lot of emerging market countries was that because the US had cut its interest rates, a lot of investors started wanting to invest in emerging markets as part of a search for yield investment strategy to find investments earning a higher rate of return. So in a lot of the emerging market countries, central banks that were operating an inflation targeting regime found themselves swamped with capital inflows. In Colombia, the effect of this was to cause bank lending growth in their banking system to rise to a 30% a year growth. Their current account deficit doubled. Their inflation rate was accelerating. Now, the standard tool that you would think a monetary authority would use when its inflation rate's accelerating is to increase its interest rate. Well, they tried that. They increased their interest rate by 4 percentage points. What do you think happened? Capital flowed all the more into their economy. And they had a more destabilized effect. So what did they then do? They said the only way we can stop the capital flow driven inflation is to engage in fiscal policy. What was the fiscal policy? Coordinating with the other authorities, the regulatory authorities and the fiscal authorities, to increase bank capital requirements and to impose a special kind of tax on short-term dollar-denominated capital inflows. When the central bank did this, it caused the lending growth in the banking system to fall from 30% to about 13%. They got a soft landing. They accomplished their inflation stability mandate. And as Oleg said, they were considered a big success democratically. The president of the central bank was a national hero because he orchestrated. He didn't have the power to do those things, but he used his inflation mandate as a way to organize the other government officials and focus their attention on putting together a combination of prudential, macroprudential policy initiatives that achieve the central bank's objective. But I think this really exemplifies what Ksenia was saying about how complicated it is to manage an inflation targeting regime in an emerging market country. Because especially in an environment where the people who are running the global financial system and monetary system are not emerging market countries, it's the US, the ECB, and you're sort of in a small boat on a big ocean, right? So I think that the difficulty for inflation targeting, where you're only using traditional monetary tools in an emerging market country, it's much more challenging. And there you need to have the flexibility not to go into doing physical things, but to be able to coordinate with other authorities. So I think it's a much more challenging institutional environment for emerging markets than for developed economies to, during normal times, to achieve stable inflation.
Oleg raised the question of when might we see inflation? And I have to say, speaking of advanced economies, I don't know the answer, but stuff happens. Changes can happen. We could have a climate crisis. You have a mild winter here, but in Australia, there are just unfathomable fiscal costs to what's happening with their fires, and we could see similar things. You could have cyber war. Court has another financial crisis, just things we haven't imagined. And this expectation that's baked into many people's mindsets that, this is how it will always be and it will never change and everything will remain very stable, I think is very naive. It dawned on me not too long ago that when I started graduate school, a PhD in economics in the mid-1970s. And we were basically taught, don't worry about anything like the Great Depression. We've got that, we're on that. We have that figured out. That's not going to happen again. It was 45 years earlier that it had happened when I was in graduate school. And you can find many quotes from famous economists that are embarrassed about it now. Absolutely not thinking about 2008 and the financial crisis. And I thought, well, if I'm starting graduate school today, and I'm thinking about high inflation, it really, in the advanced economies, occurred in the 70s, early 80s. Depends if you want to call Greece and Italy advanced economies. It lasted a little longer. It was basically a similar amount of time, 45 years. And I believe central bank independence was absolutely integral to creating this trend, and that you can look at the timing of when it's adopted in different countries and what happens to inflation. It's really, I think, hard to get away from that conclusion. But we've reached a situation where inflation is so low, and there are generations that, when you talk about, I talk to my class about inflation, I might as well be teaching them Frank Sinatra music. They just think, wow, that's just irrelevant to me. And that I think it's precisely that mentality that leads up to having a problem. And I'm not sure what the best analogy is, but let me throw out, it's a little bit like you've vaccinated the population against some communicable disease, and it has largely disappeared. And now everybody says, oh, well, we don't need vaccinations anymore because it's not a problem. And I would make an analogy to getting rid of central bank independence. Not that anything might happen right away, but I think it's a very dangerous idea.
A few points as a follow-up. The longest serving chairman of the Federal Reserve in the United States has been William McChesney Martin. He was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1951 to 1970. He served all presidents that you can think of, Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Kennedy, you name it. He coined one dictum that says, the most difficult task for a central banker is to remove the punch bowl away before the party gets going. Now, listen what kind of a cruel task it is. He needs to remove the punch bowl. People came for a party and he needs to remove the punch bowl. So he does not need, therefore, to look for popularity, because whatever he will do will be very unpopular. So he needs to be protected by the law, by the concept. We don't expect you to behave like a politician that needs to be re-elected. And when does he need to remove the punch bowl? Before the party gets going. So difficult to explain to people. You tell them, I'm doing something before, and you don't see yet any problem, but I'm already taking action today. Anticipatory action. He needs to have credibility, and people need to trust him that he's going to do something that they do not understand. There is nothing yet happening, and yet take the punch bowl away. This is why he needs to be protected by the law. This is why he needs to be professional. This is why he needs to look at the medium term. This is why it is anticipatory, and all the rest. Now, with this in mind, we go now to look at the emerging markets and industrial countries. They are really different universes. We are talking about inflation targeting as if they were in the same universe. I would suggest to divide the world into two groups. Those who have already achieved price stability, and for them they need to move from 1% to 2%, maybe from 2.5% to 2%. This is the challenge that industrial countries face, and this is small potato relatively to all the challenges of countries that have still high inflation, and the central bank needs to lower the inflation. This is what inflation targeting is coming from. This is where it is productive. This is where it has to be medium term and the rest. So those are really different. And then you ask yourself, what are the countries that suffer the most in the most recent crisis? They were Europe, this was the United States. Southeast Asia did not suffer. Latin America suffered much less, except for the movements. Why? There are two explanations. One, they were, quote, less sophisticated in quotation. They did not go after the many esoteric financial instruments. But the real reason, I think, is these countries were lucky to have had their crisis a little earlier. So the lessons were learned. Many lessons have learned. Banking sectors have been much stronger than they were before. Fiscal responsibility was there, and therefore the illusion that you can solve problems by budget deficits and that because interest rates are low, governments can finance spending without limit. All of this Mickey Mouse economics that underlie the modern monetary theory has been learned there. Ken Rogoff already said it's not modern, it's not monetary, it's not theory. But I would say this is an ingenious approach. If somebody wants to develop something, which words would you use? You would use the word modern, you would use the word theory, you would use the word monetary. You are bound to succeed because governments will embrace you. You give the governments easy way out. They don't need to impose taxes, just monetary finance. Ask each one of those central banks that have succeeded to arrest inflation. What was the secret there? I can tell you in the Israeli hyperinflation, before we started, we passed two laws. Law number one, the central bank is forbidden to finance the budget. And law number two, the budget deficit cannot exceed a given limit, or debt cannot exceed a given limit. In other words, exactly those things that protected many of these countries are now in a very irresponsible way, are promoted to go about it. And I think that it will be very great shame. It is not an accident that all of those modern monetary theory are not developed, have not been developed in countries that ever suffered from high and hyperinflation. They have developed from spoiled conditions that we see now. Thank you.
Позвольте вернуться все-таки на шаг назад. У нас еще все-таки тема финансовой стабильности.
If you don't mind, we'll
прозвучала
get
несколько
back
раз, ее надо
to
обсудить. Но
financial
вот в
stability.
завершение тема,
We have to
собственно,
discuss
монетарной
it.
политики.
But before that, to close on the
Здорово,
discussion of the monetary
формулировка
policy,
известная, да, про то, что нужно забирать алкоголь
there
на
is
вечеринку в самом разгаре и так далее, и так далее.
this
Такое ощущение,
dictum
что все-таки в этот раз
which you mentioned to
вечеринка
remove the
пока не
punch bowl
получается.
before the party, but
Нулевые
it seems that
ставки
there is no party going
все-таки
at
это
all,
удел многих стран.
because many
Хронические нулевые в
countries
Японии теперь, нулевые,
have
скорее всего,
zero
хронические в Европе с высокой
interest
вероятностью,
rates
Национальный банк
in
Швейцарии,
Japan and in
Скандинавия.
Europe, in Switzerland,
Это не
in
единичные случаи. И
Scandinavian
Федрезерв даже
countries,
с
and this is
Австралией и
not
Новой
a
Зеландией,
unique
это
case. Even
страны,
the
где еще
Fed,
10 лет назад ставки были существенно выше,
Australia,
чем
New
сегодня.
Zealand, they used to have higher
Все-таки
interest rates in the past,
И вот
several years
еще
ago.
господин Френкель упомянул
Mr. Frankel, apart from that,
exit
has
strategy, да, вот
mentioned an
как
exit
из этого
strategy.
всего затем избавляться. Все-таки
How do you
не
remove
обсуждаем ли мы
all
этот
of that
вопрос?
afterwards? How do you clean up the mess?
Не знаком ли вообще уважаемый президиум с буквами ММТ только лишь по
do
той причине, что на
distinguished
самом деле традиционная
members
монетарная политика, ну непонятно, что она
of
сейчас
the
может
panelists
сделать и
know
какие задачи она
this
может решить.
word, unconventional monetary policy, simply because
Предлагаю ответить любому «да». Пожалуйста, Олег Вячеславович.
the old monetary policy no longer works. This is the most important thing which we are supposed to discuss today.
As Mr. Frankel has said that you need to be preventive, to remove the punch cup before the party starts. But you need to be knowledgeable of the ropes, of how it all works. Why am I removing the cup? You should answer this question, but for that you need to know how it all functions. And currently the central bank is, despite all their wisdom, are not fully aware of the ramifications of the policies in place. They seem to be efficient here and now, at this point. I mean that the financial stability is here, allegedly, and we have moved one step back from the precipice and the inflation is tamed. But what will follow? What steps will follow? Real negative interest rates would not give any positive yields, any positive outcomes. The financial capital, the working capital wouldn't flow into the economy. And the corporations wouldn't use that because banks wouldn't use that. Banks would prefer to switch their passives into derivatives and other instruments not to pay out. They either preserve those passive holdings in nominal value or just capitalize on gambling with derivatives, which is a popular trend. So we're already seeing some negative after effects. So probably we should forgo that altogether. Inflation, targeting maybe about expanding balance sheets. So the lack of answer of how it will tell on the corporations, grassroots, and the inflation parameters is the greatest challenge for today. Now it looks fine, currently. But what happens next? Whether debt can grow forever? Mr. Oreshkin, our economic development minister, at the first session on the modern monetary theory, advocated for the Chinese experience. The central bank and the fiscal bodies of China going hand in hand and trying to support the demand using both the fiscal deficit and to a certain extent, he didn't mention that, but still they did the administrative they had the administrative sway on the loan allocations between banks. He believed it to be a technocratic approach, meriting attention. Well, this is the main issue for the major central banks, for our central bank to a lesser extent today, because so far it is transparent. But globally, we don't have the answer, and this is the main risk.
I would add, I can see you want to give an answer, but Maxim Oreshkin was just quoted. But the other person who can be quoted is Ray Dalio, who recently wrote a paper called A Shift in Paradigm, a Paradigm Shift. And he actually says that the times currently are very reminiscent of the 30s and 40s of the 20th century, where the Federal Reserve and the Treasury were working closely together, well, primarily due to the fact that those were the war times. But even after the war, for several years, the Federal Reserve was present in the debt market all across the curve, controlling all the interest rates entirely. Is that where the monetary policy is headed currently? Mr. Rogov, and then...
Well, first of all, I mean, there was a period where there wasn't an independent central bank. That didn't really happen until the Treasury Monetary Accord of 1951, is it? And we lived in a different world then. First of all, there was wartime. But I think another important point is there wasn't a lot of debt in that period. The private debt had largely been wiped out, and the state and local by the Great Depression. There was some, but it's very small, very, very small compared to the federal government. Very importantly, and I don't think I could emphasize this enough, you didn't have the pensions that you have now that are a much bigger issue than the debt that we look at and that modern monetary theory looks at. Alan Greenspan, you've mentioned, often like to quote the work of Alan Auerbach and Larry Kodlikoff, who basically counted every government promise as debt. That's, I think, quite exaggerated. But so, in other words, future medical payments, future pension payments, future everything. And he would say, well, the real debt's not 7 trillion, that's what it was back then. It's 70 trillion. And that's an exaggeration. That's not right, because you don't actually have to pay those other debts. But you can't walk away from them that easily. Today, those numbers would be 23 million and 230 million. And those are about Kodlikoff's estimates. I think the right way to look at it is the market debt. This is the sliver that sits upon the other debt that's senior debt, and that's going to get paid. That's why the interest rates are so low. But there's no market for the pension debts, for the other things that are being, facing risk. We live in a very different world. And if I have to say, if there's something we really don't understand, and I think many people who write on fiscal policy are guilty of this, we have a new kind of overhang that just didn't exist, which are these pension debts. They're private debts also. We don't know how they're going to play out. But let me tell you, the presumption that you can just walk away from those, that you don't have to pay them if you need to pay the market debts, or you can cut them, that's very strong. If you look at Puerto Rico, they went into bankruptcy. If you look at the city of Detroit, it went into bankruptcy. The pension funds got cut a little. The debt holders got cut a lot. So they're new issues. And some of this time is different, debt is fine. I think it's an illusion, because they're only seeing a little piece of what's going on. And I want to be clear, just that I don't sound overly hawkish. Issuing debt, for example, to deal with a recession, issuing debt to have a financial crisis. I'd even say having more debt to do economic reforms. If you go through a period of aggressive economic reforms in Russia, for example, and you use debt to stimulate the economy, to cushion the transition, they're legitimate uses. But it's a different game in that sense. But if you focus monetary policy on stabilizing prices as opposed to all the other things, Jacob gave a wonderful list, then I think we're still in a world where the monetary authorities can deliver that.
I agree with everything Ken just said. I do want to point out again something else that's different now from the 1930s. In the 1930s, central banks had failed disastrously, not just in the US, by the way. I would say that you could say that about the whole coordination of the major central banks had produced a global deflation and a global depression that hit almost every country very hard. If you look at the current situation, I would say central banks have demonstrated amazing skill in the last decade. And the problem is that because of this debt overhang problem that Ken's referring to, we're now at risk that central banks, with their inflation targeting mandate, may be undermined by what we call fiscal dominance. That is, ultimately, even though they have an inflation targeting mandate, if the only way to resolve the arithmetic of the government's debt is to print money, central banks will print money. That's just an arithmetic requirement. But I want to emphasize the success, the institutional treasure that we right now have, that we didn't have historically, not just in the 30s, but I would say at any time. Let me remind you, I was here in 2015. Many people, myself included, believed that Russia might have a financial crisis. Why didn't you have one? Because the central bank was smart enough to say, inflation targeting means we're going to let the exchange rate move. That was courageous. It was difficult. It wasn't easy. I think you probably could get someone on this panel to talk about how it wasn't easy. But it wasn't just Russia. It was also Australia. It was also Canada. That was courageous, and it meant that inflation targeting required the central banks not to target certain things. And they did that. That was quite successful. So not only did you have success from Mario Draghi, Ben Bernanke at the center of the global financial system, you also have had enormous success by central banks in emerging market countries. And now imagine, here we are, all governments all over the world are running up their debts. What's the consequence? We're going to destroy the credibility of the institutions of central banking at a time when they've never been greater. That would be a pity.
Do you want to add? Yes, please.
3 points. Number one, you started a few minutes ago saying interest rates are zero. Where is the party that we need to take the punch bowl away from? If you only look at central banks' balance sheets, and you see that during the past decade, the size of the balance sheet of the US Fed has gone up by about 5-fold. No more, 450% today compared with 2007. Bank of Japan, 570 index compared with 100 in 2007. That's where the accumulation and the unconventional part took place. And the question is, what is unique about this period? And I think that we don't remind us enough of the classic book by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt about This Time is Different. The reason things are very different today in the past decade and during the past crisis is the role of the capital markets, balance sheets, assets. It's not just flows. Now, capital markets, I said at the beginning, is the mechanism that connects the present to the future. So if we want to have a long-term perspective, we are going to play with fire if we don't protect the integrity of capital markets. And capital markets are the things that have memory and therefore have continuous referendum. So let me make one more point about this. Ken mentioned the size of debt, pensions, etc. I will add to it student loans. Now, student loans in the US is a very large number. In the political debate, one or two of the candidates have a great suggestion how to solve the student loan crisis, which is eliminate the debt. And since the banks are always good target, and the banks will absorb it. Now, this shows the ignorance of how not to deal with issues that relate to capital markets. One needs to be extremely careful. And finally, the last remark, there was an analogy to small boats in a large ocean. It is indeed the case. We are all, each country is a boat in the large ocean. Some are larger boats, some are smaller boats. The ocean has a lot of storms. If you are the captain of a small boat, you cannot change the size of the storm. So the only thing you can do is strengthen your boat. And frankly, the recipe is very conventional. Solid fiscal policy, solid monetary, etc., etc. Every captain of a small boat knows it. If you are a large captain of a large boat, of course, what you do also affects the storm of the ocean itself. That's when you have global responsibilities. So we need to recognize division of responsibilities, small, large, but it is still the same ocean. Thank you.
Спасибо, Ксения Валентиновна. Я все же обращусь к вам с
Thank you,
вопросом не о
Madam
том,
Yudaeva. I
сложно
will
ли было
turn to
переходить
you
к инфляционному
asking
таргетированию,
not about whether it was difficult to
с
switch to
вопросом
inflation
как раз о
targeting,
финансовой
but rather
стабильности. Да, вот эта
I would
роль
ask you a
центральных
question on
банков,
the
она действительно
financial
новая и стала
stability.
очень
This role
важной в
of the
последние
central banks
десятилетия.
is a new one and
Как
has
банки
become of
России
importance over the past
находят
decade.
баланс между
How the Bank of
регулированием
Russia
и
manages to strike
патернализмом,
the
скажем так,
balance between
в
the
банковской системе.
regulation and the prudent
Я
paternalist
паттернализм,
attitude.
честно говоря, не очень хорошо понимаю.
I
Мне кажется,
I don't grasp what you mean about paternalism.
но не нашли. Что
Probably you looked
конкретно
for a
Мне
different
хочется
word.
понять, как
I
принимаются
want to
решения.
understand how
Вот есть вопрос
decisions
финансовой
are
стабильности,
made. There
связанный
is
с
a threat of
каким-нибудь
financial
финансовым институтом.
stability,
Как
supposing
дальше происходит
with respect to
процесс
a
внутри
financial
центрального банка? Как
institution related
формируются
to a
ставки? Мы
financial
все примерно
institution.
понимаем, на
We know
что
how the
реагирует
rates
центральный банк. Мы
are
понимаем, как сам
set and how
центральный
central
банк
banks
внутри себя
respond and
решает
to what
вопрос,
they
связанный
respond,
с
we know quite
вызовами со
well.
стороны финансовой стабильности, и как он
But
действует.
how financial stability challenges
про вызовы
are
финансовой
tackled
стабильности,
inside
на самом
central
деле, это
banks.
очень
Financial
сложный
stability
термин,
challenges is a
поэтому
difficult
каждый честно
term,
понимает
and it may
свое,
have
и
different
здесь как раз
understandings,
изменение, которое произошло за последние
different
15 лет,
perceptions, and the changes in the past
это,
15 years
конечно же, повышение роли
entail that, and as a result of these,
потому
macroprudential analysts' role has been raised. Before 2007, it was considered that regulators were to oversee the stability of some of the institutions, but after the downturn, a new perception emerged that because of the inextricable links in the financial sector, it is important to see the systemic risks that are not obvious at the level of the separate financial institutions. I may cite a typical example of our practice. Like last year, we introduced a new element of the macroprudential supervision, the borrower's payment to overall debt factor, which was the new parameter we introduced. And in this country, we are seeing a rapid growth of the collateral-free lending, uncollateralized lending, and we introduced, therefore, another parameter to monitor things. And I am in constant dialogue with different banks, and many of these have their own risk assessment tools. They're using the AI and the big data and whatever you want, all those buzzwords. And many of these banks have been telling me, like, look at the level of our bank. This factor payment to income ratio is not too important an indicator. What matters more for us is kind of we may issue a loan, lend the money to a borrower that has no track record, and afterwards he or she would take several loans more, and his overall load would increase manifold. So each separate bank may underestimate the overall risks for the system with respect to a specific individual borrower, because he or she may have borrowed money from many banks at the same time. So what we should do is to control the overall risk. So we should have a systemic snapshot and break down per each of the borrowers. And risks, individuals' risks, may become systemic for the financial sector. So you shouldn't look from the standpoint of a separate financial institution only. This is why macroprudential supervision has been going forward. I don't see any paternalistic. I kind of referred paternalistic, speaking about the consolidation of the banking sector and respective fund. It has nothing to do with that. I thought you meant like defending the consumer's rights when you mentioned paternalistic, because not all of the consumers. But all the consumers may be aware of what they have been doing. And the fund you mentioned is a different story. Definitely it is related to the financial risks. Why big entities, big institutions are not allowed to go bust? We have withdrawn lots of licenses from banks, I mean the Central Bank of Russia. So it would be wrong to say that we are paternalistic, but major entities have not been allowed to go bust, and thus we have raised the overall capital to avoid the knock-on effect in the banking system, to stop the system from veering into a massive financial crisis. We had to do, as others do, such things to nip that in the bud. Conventionally, it is done with the help of the fiscal sources. In this country and in other countries as well, Ben Bernanke was mentioned, and with the help of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, he also did some bailouts, and he got stripped of his competence. It was back in 2010, and now the Fed cannot do that, but us can, because of the financial stability, for the sake of the financial stability. Our balance sheet has increased, definitely, and we moved from a structural deficit to a structural surplus, and definitely that had a toll on our monetary policies, but up to a certain moment, central banks can manage inflation in all circumstances, in a structural deficit or in a structural surplus. I don't recall the exact figures, but ours is below 5%. It's around 2%. I mean, this value would not give a considerable impact, would not be considerable toll on the monetary policies. I mean, the size of our structural surplus. So the central banks go beyond their conventional mandates, which is the rates. Mr. Rogov. Mr. Rogov, you have to leave us earlier, unfortunately. Thank you so much for participating, sir.
Mr. Kalomiris, on the matter of financial stability and the central bank's role as the lender of last resort, what is your opinion on the appropriate framework?
One thing I would say that, which I hinted at in my first comment, is that the best of all worlds is first to have a framework, which I would say in most of the world we don't. What we have is somehow we do things when they have to be done without necessarily the authority, and then we, as they say, it's better to apologize than to ask for permission, right? So I think that's not desirable because it risks legitimacy. So the first thing I think is the lender of last resort authority, ideally, and I mentioned Canada as a great case, is one in which we've had a discussion about what the boundaries are, who's got to be asked for permission in advance, and we structure it that way. The second thing I would say that's really not in existence is the right trade-off, the right choice about the way that we help financial institutions. So this is something I'll talk about later this afternoon, actually, that if you looked in 1960, how many countries had deposit insurance? Think about it if you don't know the answer. And so the answer is, as of 1962, I think 1 in the whole world, the United States. By the 1970s, only a handful still had any deposit insurance. Now it's almost all countries have some deposit insurance, and those who have had it over the past 2 decades, they've been making it more and more generous. We've gone from a lender of last resort framework in which assistance was conditional, partial, and very much thinking about the possible incentive problems that come from protection, to a new framework globally where we provide across the board protection in advance or bailouts that are across the board. The incentive consequences, I'll talk more about this later, have been disastrous. That's why we're currently living in the last 30 years in a pandemic of global crisis, because protection has expanded dramatically. So I think the most important point about the lender of last resort is we have this wonderful set of mechanisms and technologies that have been developed over the past 200 years. And what they have in common is that they're very smart. I'll give you many examples. Bagehot's rule as lending of collateralized lending is one particular mechanism. It was designed to limit abuse of the lending. That's what Bagehot's rule is all about, to provide assistance while limiting abuse. Another mechanism that was developed by the Banque de France in the 1880s, then used very widely since then, is something called the lifeboat mechanism. The lifeboat mechanism creates, when the entire banking system is in crisis, you find a way to provide assistance to deal with the problem in which the banks are providing actually assistance to each other. This mechanism has some really interesting positive incentive features. I can't go through all of them right now, but the point is these mechanisms, these smart mechanisms that had good incentive properties of lender of last resort assistance, and I would also say TARP had some good incentive qualities. That's where it's now not the central bank, but it's the government that's providing a lender of last resort assistance by actually buying preferred stock issued by banks. This also has some very favorable incentive features. And what I want to emphasize is all of these smart ideas are conditional, partial, and very much thinking about the incentive balancing of assistance without across-the-board guarantees. And the problem of the world right now is that while we're being very stingy with lender of last resort, we're providing across-the-board guarantees. This is really dumb.
Why is it?
Why is it happening?
Why is it dumb?
Well, it's dumb because the incentive features of across-the-board protection in advance encourages systemic risk and leads to financial disasters. But the reason it's been happening is that it's often the solution that's the easiest in the short run. Where did these guarantees come from? And I'll tell you, before 1999, the IMF had no institutional position on whether there should be deposit insurance. In 1999, the IMF changed, and it said it's best practice to have deposit insurance. What happened? The IMF was running so many programs in the late 1990s and worried about its own resources, I believe, it became myopic. It actually was thinking the easiest way to minimize how much IMF programs money has to be channeled is to have less financial crises. So we want to get countries to adopt deposit insurance so that they don't have crises. It was very myopic. The World Bank also did it. The EU did it. All of them at the same time. Why? Because financial crises were happening. And they saw it as a short-term fix. It's a short-term fix. It's a long-term disaster. So the world has actually moved in the wrong direction on how to think about assisting banks. Instead of smart policies, we're moving toward very disastrous across-the-board protections, either ex-ante protections like deposit insurance or ex-post protections like guaranteeing that we'll bail out any bank that fails and all the creditors, whether explicitly or implicitly. This is a recipe for more risk. And that's why we're living through a 30 or 40-year period where the risks have never been as big as they are now.
Олег Вячеславович, а это правда, что когда вы возглавляли
Oleg,
ФСФР,
is it true that when you were the head of the
создание мегарегулятора?
FSR, it was your idea to set up a mega regulator, or maybe you were contemplating something similar? We were not just contemplating, we were trying to set up a mega regulator. And there was an option what we discussed with Sergei Ignatieff. We discussed the scenario which eventually did happen on the platform of the central bank. How efficient of a structure do you think it is right now, and what are the key issues? On the whole, the experience demonstrates that this has turned out to be an efficient solution, even though it was motivated by slightly different things, in particular material things like salaries for the employees, because there is a universal system for paying federal officials, and the regulator is on a different footing somewhat. And moreover, there is a thing of exchange of information. The central bank possesses a huge bulk of data about the financial system, and there was our federal agency, and the exchange of information was somewhat difficult due to different legal standing, and it prevented these two institutions from acting efficiently. Right now, I am in favor of twin peaks, as it were. When there are two peaks, two instances working together, maybe in Russia it's premature. What am I referring to? I'm referring to splitting the responsibility for financial stability on the one hand, and on the other hand, the protection of financial services customers. Thank you. I would like to rephrase the question a little bit. Mr. Frankel, Mr. Kalamiris, Madam Yudava, maybe you'd like to answer that. I know it's difficult to respond if you work in a central bank. Do you need to put a Chinese firewall between monetary policy on the one hand and all other policies related to financial stability?
This is an easy one. The answer is no. When we talk about, let me go back, many countries have re-examined the question of where should bank supervision be. And if you give it to a McKinsey company to give you an answer about the organizational design, there is a lot of logic of eventually dotted line, non-dotted line, interaction, walls, windows. But the issue is not only an organizational design. The issue has to be with practicality. It is extremely important that the central bank has full data about the financial situation of banks and financial institutions if it is to perform its role in contributing to financial stability. The only way it will have the complete, timely data is if it has the authority to deal with these matters. And I'm saying it first from experience, second, looking at the UK experience. In the UK, they initially divided those two functions, and one was in the central bank, one was in a different authority, etc. And then when the crisis arose and the central bank did not have the data, as Mervyn King said, if we only had the data in real time, we would have been able to deal with some of the issues ahead of time. Then one realized, and indeed they have restructured it. There is a great logic in division in taking the functions of consumer protection separately and things of that type. But when it comes to financial stability and price stability and monetary policy, I think that there is a great logic to put them together. It is not an imperialistic approach. It is a very practical approach. I will come back to it from another angle. The issue of tools that monetary policy has. When I went to school, it was very simple. The tool of monetary policy was interest rate. With the passage of time, the responsibilities that monetary policy got and the financial sophistication of markets change and tools have evolved. And now that interest rates went to zero, some central banks say we don't have a problem of tools because we still have macroprudential, we still have guidance, etc. Of course, macroprudential and guidance are important instruments, but let's face it, still the most important instrument of monetary policy is interest rate. And if you are locked at a zero interest rate, there is just no question in my mind that your ability to function is more limited than otherwise. This is one of the costs of having this very long period of unconventional policies that pushed interest rates to zero We spoke already about some other distortions, but this also means that monetary policy is less potent.
I want to make 3 points about this issue, and I just wrote a very long article just on this question. So the first point I want to make is about why you don't want to put everything in the central bank. So why don't you put everything? Let's say regulatory power, for example. And I want to distinguish regulatory from supervisory and examination authorities. These are, it seems like it's all the same. They're not the same. So regulatory authority is a fiscal decision, first of all, because it involves taxes. Regulation is tax. The other thing is, the history in the United States has been that the central bank cares more about monetary policy than regulatory policy. When it has to make a political deal, and it makes political deals constantly, it makes bad regulatory decisions on purpose to solve political problems to free monetary policy. That's the history of the Federal Reserve as a regulator. So it's much better to give someone regulatory authority who cares only about regulatory authority, because regulatory authority will be thrown under the bus by the central bank. It has been over and over again in the history of the Federal Reserve. So far, I think I'm in agreement with Jacob, which is there's no good reason to put regulatory authority in the central bank. By the way, it's there in the US, except for one thing, macroprudential. What is that? Whatever regulations already exist, you can decide we're right now going through a loan boom and we need to increase capital requirements, maybe. Like I said in Colombia, for example, when they had to do that. So I think given the central bank has an inflation targeting mandate, it makes sense to give it at least some input, if not absolute authority, on the moving of the macroprudential toolkit. And finally, I also agree with Jacob that if you're a lender of last resort and you're managing financial stability, you have to have examination authority. Now, where it's a little tricky is that doesn't mean you have to be a supervisor of everything. You have to have examination authority. It's not clear to me that you have to be certainly not a consumer protection supervisor and many other things. So I think the right way to answer the question is say, what do you really need to put with the central bank? Certainly examination ability, some supervisory authority that's relevant to its prudential, to its monetary lender of last resort mandate, and I think some role in macroprudential. But you want to draw the line there, because the more you put other authorities into the central bank, the more you threaten its legitimacy, because you're creating fiscal power in the central bank, and you're also creating the opportunity for the central bank to make political deals, which I think are very counterproductive. So I think we've got it wrong right now in the US.
Ксения Валентиновна, ну мы подошли, собственно, уже к самому концу сессии, но мне кажется, что...
Madam Yudava, it's almost the end of the session, but it brings us back to the question of this conflict, the balance where the limit lies, beyond which it's nefarious for the central bank to go. Well, for our colleagues, I can tell you how it functions in Russia. Well, we do have sort of a firewall which has been erected, but to a certain extent. In regulation, it is important to keep the goal straight before you. You understand the goal you are pursuing. This is how institutions have to be designed. It's of paramount importance. Why is that? Regulation has to be done based upon the risks. And there is no point in trying to add additional functions unrelated to risks. As I've mentioned previously, indeed, at the level of micro-regulation, micro-institutions, you do not see all the risks. But The issue with separating the regulation from central banks is that if you've got a separate regulator that regulates financial institutions, then it has no sufficient stimuli to address the systemic risks as a whole. It is the central bank that has the reasons to think about the overall systemic stability. If these are two separate institutions, it is always the issue, and we can see that very often. It is a serious issue in terms of using macroprudential policies. In Russia, at the central bank, we've got the Committee on Financial Stability. All the departments are part of this committee. They come together, they discuss the decisions to be taken. Some supervisory powers, of course, the central bank is vested with it. It's important to understand what is happening in the financial system as a whole. But at the same time, this supervisory power should be well balanced, especially if the bank is the lender of last resort. As for the mega regulator status, I think in terms of Russia's specifics, in terms of ensuring financial stability, that was an important decision and the right one too. The thing is, we've got many institutions, many financial groups that have a wide range of participants. So even in terms of examining them, it is very good if you have one single regulator that looks at all of them. It is easier to regulate, it is easier to manage the risks, and the system. And it prevents the play on the interests of different regulators, if we had those. And we did that precisely for that purpose. The thing is, risks also spill over from one part of the financial system to other. Since we've got one mega regulator, we can coordinate our actions and efforts. Like and the lending market, when we harmoniously introduced both for micro banks and for microfinancial lending companies the same standards. And since we did that, we managed to prevent the spillover of risks from one part of the system into the other. And of course, this can only be achieved easily if you've got one single regulator, rather than a whole bunch of fragmented regulatory authorities that are each responsible for their own sphere of competence. So I think it's a good thing that the regulators have been bundled together. The thing is, we ran out of time 6 minutes ago, so I'd like to say a huge thank you. I don't think we need to summarize the discussion so as to save time. Thank you very much for participating.